They will catch me. They will hang me.
Father Logan will go to them. He will tell them.
He cannot tell them what he heard in confession.
The French New Wave celebrated I Confess as one of the great Hitchcock films. In fact, I think in the early 50s, when they polled the French New Wave critics who became the French New Wave filmmakers, I Confess was at the top of their list of the great Hitchcock films. It's not one of his best known. It is one of his most serious. And I think one of his most personal, because Hitchcock was brought up by strict Jesuits, had a very strict Catholic background, and this is a story about a Catholic priest who must keep the secrets of the confessional, even though he knows that by revealing the secret of the confessional, he will save himself from being implicated, and is implicated in a murder. And he knows who did it because it was confessed to him, but he can't say it because that's part of his vow.
But you can't tell them as long as you are a priest, can you?
It's a very tricky, again, subversive Hitchcock setup. And how he plays it, what he does with it, is interesting.
Nos Deux Consciences, a play by Paul Anselme, whose real name was Raymond Borde, a man of letters of late 19th century and early 20th century France, had haunted Hitchcock ever since he saw it in the 30s in London. And what obviously haunted him about was the basic situation, which remains in the film. Hitchcock took the situation and played every imaginable variation on it in drafts of the screenplay. Very early on, he decided that he would have the priest have a more direct connection with the murder, and that it was done to eliminate a blackmailer who knew about an affair he had had with the wife of a prominent politician. And that indeed the priest would have had an illegitimate child. All of this before becoming a priest, which is in a way perfectly legitimate. And boy, did the censors ever not go for that one. One of the fun things about reading the extensive correspondence between Joseph Breen, the head of the production code office, the head censor, and Hitchcock on this particular script is that Breen was a Catholic with the same Jesuit training that Hitchcock had. So he was very sensitive to things like, well, what if the priest looks at the murderer during the courtroom scene, betraying his knowledge that this man is in some way implicated? A very Hitchcockian thing to do. People are always looking in revealing ways in Hitchcock films, and Breen said, no, that would be a violation of the seal of the confession. So it's like a debate between two Jesuit schoolboys about what does and doesn't violate the priest's oath. Eventually, Hitchcock had to give up two things. Very early on, the idea of the illegitimate child, and later, the idea that the priest would die at the end, although he would have preferred to have it that way.
Then they would shoot you quickly, and you must suffer much. Look.
It's very much like The Wrong Man, which is also about a man who is falsely accused and is only saved and only partially saved from the infernal machinery of justice at the end when the real man is caught and confesses. It's almost a dry run for The Wrong Man, which is a very dark film, like I Confess, very dark in the way it's shot, and also using real locations much more extensively than Hitchcock had done before. I Confess was shot in Quebec, and when you go into the kitchen of the hotel at the end during the chase and you see the people working there, those are the real people working there.
When you think about I Confess, it begins in darkness. I mean, these are these shadowy streets in Quebec, which is such an interesting setting, because Quebec is really like an old world city that's plunked down in the new world. You know, it's got cobblestone streets, it has old-fashioned buildings, and he does a lot with that in the movie. I mean, and so it's a very shadowy context in which this drama is played out. And to me, it's more noirish than most of Hitchcock's movies.
Keller, why are you here this time of night?
Visually, I quite like the movie. And, that famous sequence at the beginning, all those one-way signs, direction. I mean, you almost want his credit to appear over all those signs that say direction, They're nice. I mean, it's a nice little sequence. And, of course, they are all pointing eventually to the site of the murder. I mean, all those arrows, which is kind of a nice visual gimmick. So it's a movie of quite palpable visual pleasures.
He has in the lead one of the great American actors, Montgomery Clift, who was the first of the so-called, quote, method, unquote, actors. He preceded Marlon Brando and Jimmy Dean with his introspection and his different way of acting. He was one of the most beautiful men in movies, and this film was one of his first films.
What would you want me to say?
And he's superb in it and captures brilliantly that ambivalence that, again, this priest has.
A man of intelligence would not be led to believe anything on so little evidence.
He has an affair before he goes into the war with Anne Baxter, and then evidently has some extraordinary change of heart, which is never completely identified. And he chooses to renounce his love for Anne Baxter and becomes a priest. She never stops loving him, even though she's married to somebody else.
I was very aware of Montgomery Clift from 1948, when I was at Warner Brothers. He had done a film, The Search, with Fred Zinnemann around that time, and I was aware of him. And then a friend who'd been on Broadway, who was also in the contract at Warner Brothers, had told me a lot about how great Montgomery Clift was and what a great star this guy was going to be.
I've asked Father Logan to join us.
I first met Monty on the Warner Brothers lot. He had just come back from doing the locations of I Confess in Quebec. They were doing the interiors at Warner Brothers, and I was on a run on a film called Three Sailors and a Girl. And so Monty was finishing up I Confess, and I was doing this. I was a sailor, and we met, me as a sailor. I was costumed as a sailor, and he was costumed as a priest, and we used to grab a hamburger or something together, this sailor and this priest.
Clift is very good in the film. One of the things that he did, which doesn't seem to me to be all that intellectual or methody, was study the way priests walked in that cassock and imitate it perfectly. And I think that Clift had one of those things that is very important to a Hitchcock actor. He had incredible eyes, which expressed the soul, because that's really a big part of what Hitchcock's style is about. You know, he said that bad movies are photographs of people talking. A Hitchcock movie is a photograph of people thinking, and it helps to have that marvelous look that Montgomery Clift is able to give all the way through this film, because it's you're totally transparent to what he's thinking and feeling at every moment. I think he's a very good Hitchcock actor.
The first time that I ever saw him working out something on I Confess, there was a scene where he's painting a room, and he was working on like a ladder, how he would paint this room, what he would do. He was like that. He worked everything out.
Hasn't God forgiven me thanks to you? But the police never would.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, I was living in New York. I had just gotten married, and I went up to visit my father in Quebec, I think it was, and watch them shoot. And the fascinating thing was that there was a scene where a wonderful German actor called Oe Hasse was doing a very difficult scene from the stage of a room in the hotel. And he did this scene, and then they cut to Montgomery Clift walking up to see him on the stage. And Oe Hasse did this, and it was a very difficult speech to do.
To kill you now would be a favor to you. You have no friend.
And he did it, and everything was fine. And then they took probably 4 hours to shoot Montgomery Clift walking up, because he had to think about it.
He didn't want to have to deal with all that method stuff. And when he asked Clift at one point to please look up when he came out of the courthouse because he wanted to cut to the windows, Clift said, I don't know if I would look up. And of course, anything like that would drive Hitchcock crazy. If you don't look up, I can't cut. Because it's, again, Hitchcock's point of view cinema. Clift looks, you see what he sees, you see his reaction. That's pure cinema, as Hitchcock used to call it. And he loved that kind of filmmaking. Shot of the person, shot of what he sees, reaction. But nevertheless, I think without Clift, the picture would be tremendously depleted. It's the extraordinary depth of feeling that you get from Clift's face, from his movements, from his seriousness, from his sobriety, from his romanticism, that it makes the picture as powerful as it is.
Are you a human being, Inspector? You think it's important for me to tell you why I was being blackmailed? You don't care whom I hurt, just so long as I answer all your questions.
I only want to clear a murder.
Yes, I know. You only want everything clear.
The use of the flashback in I Confess is like the use of the lying flashback in Stage Fright. The whole story is told at the beginning of Stage Fright in flashback, and it turns out to be a lie. In this case, you're flashing back to the story of how Father Logan had this love affair before he became a priest with a woman who obviously has never gotten over it, but he chose to go ahead. And it's all told from her point of view. It's told in a very romantic style, almost trashy style, not like you would see in a Hitchcock film. And Truffaut thought that that kind of dreamy romance novel style of the flashback made it a lying flashback too, because it leaves out so much of what is going on in the Logan character, which is his gradual decision to give his life to the priesthood. It's really being told from the point of view of this silly romantic woman.
Hitchcock even goes to slow motion when he recounts her coming down the stairs into an embrace with Monty Clift. Very poetic and very openly romantic and emotional, which is unusual for Hitchcock to go quite that far.
Inspector, I beg you, consider if your line of questioning has to be so personal.
That is for me to decide, Father.
And there is in the relationship between Clift and Malden something that's very interesting. Because Clift is a kind of man of faith, and Malden is a man of reason. You know, he is a guy reasonably, step by step, trying to solve this crime.
But you do understand, don't you, that I must consider every scrap of information?
Yes.
When a murder has been committed, each scrap of information is important to the police.
Of course.
He doesn't care about love, religion, the higher things. He's a kind of technocrat going along his path.
You see, with a murder, one has to jump from one detail to another. Forgive me, perhaps I jumped too suddenly for you.
And that's an interesting relationship that is kind of explored rather nicely in the movie. Not in an overt, but in a kind of an implied way.
And the difficulty perhaps is that, well, we aren't thinking from the same point of view. Could it be that, Father?
Carl Malden was a New York actor, a theater actor, who gives a superb performance as the policeman. One of the more intelligent policemen in Hitchcock's movies. Usually the cops in Hitch's movies are pretty idiotic. This one's menacing.
Keller! Give yourself up! Stay back. Have them send over some tear gas.
Significantly, the wife who gives him away and saves Clift is named Alma, which was Hitchcock's wife's name.
One of the other character people in it that I think is so great to see that doesn't really have that great a role, but should be watched with great respect is the lady who plays the killer's wife, and that's Dolly Haas, who is one of the great actresses of the German cinema and gave up her career to marry the caricaturist Al Hirschfeld, who drew caricatures in the New York Times for years. And she had a great career in Germany and gave it up for him, moved to America. And because the Hirschfelds were great friends of Hitchcock, she did that small part. But she had a great film career in Germany, and there's even a museum in Germany that has a lot of her artifacts about her career. But today, most people don't know her except as Al Hirschfeld's wife. But this is one of the few times you can ever see the great Dolly Haas on film.
What?
Again.
What is it? What is she saying?
She says, forgive me.
But then it opened, and he wanted very much for me to see it. He was very disappointed in the reviews, how they spoke of him. And I remember one review, there was a critic he admired in England that he was very upset about because he rather disregarded Monty and I Confess by saying Montgomery Clift gives this performance of the priest in his familiar, bottled-up acting style. And it offended Monty very much and disturbed him very much. And I don't think the reviews were all that wonderful for Monty.
Do you want me to lie to you?
No, I don't want you to lie to me. But I don't want you to lie to yourself.
He accepted all my compliments about I Confess with great happiness, but complained about how he was being perceived by the critics. They were like on to him, his style or something like that. But he's wonderful, and it's a wonderful film.
In the early 60s, I was working at a revival theater in New York, and we were showing I Confess. And who should arrive one afternoon but Monty Clift? This is, of course, 10 years after his accident, so his face was not quite the same. And it was only a couple of years before he died. And at one point during the movie, he came and stood in the back. In those days, you could smoke in theaters, and he's standing in the back smoking. And I went over to him and asked him how it felt to see himself in this movie. And all he said was, "It's hard. It's very hard."
Monty was concerned about spiritual matters. I mean, he was in analysis. He was always in analysis. But he was very concerned about God. And one of the beautiful things he had was a letter from Thornton Wilder. Thornton Wilder wrote The Skin of Our Teeth and was the greatest of American playwrights, I think. And Monty obviously asked Thornton Wilder at one point, said, "Is there a God?" And Thornton Wilder took time to think about it and wrote him this beautiful letter, which Monty had, and he used to like to read it. And the answer is, there's a bridge between life and death, which you can call God. And that the only thing that we know is that that bridge is traversed by our love of those who die, go on to another world. As long as we remember them and as long as we love them, they're alive. And that was his answer about God. And Monty treasured this letter from Wilder. And I think that I Confess was fulfilling in that way because the seriousness of the devotion of the priest matched a serious devotion that Monty had for himself in relationship to other people. He was the most generous, thoughtful, considerate, wonderful friend you could have, and priestly in his friendship, but tons of fun.
Have you any idea who might have put this cassock in your trunk?
I can't say.
I like I Confess, and a myth I would like to scotch about it is that it didn't make money. And if you love Hitchcock, you have to love this film. It's one of his most visually stunning films. The way that he turns real marble and clouds and concrete into shot after shot that express states of the soul nobody can do today.
And I think it brought out something very serious and spiritual in Alfred Hitchcock. I think he believed in the film. And it's certainly beautifully photographed. No film has ever been more beautifully photographed in black and white. And it's an important film and a beautiful film on the level of the romance between this wonderful young man who then becomes a priest and is devoted to his vows and his priesthood. You don't often have a film where someone is deeply involved with God.